For months, Republicans have been confident that they could retake control of the House and Senate this November. But after Kansas voters rejected a ballot measure that would have opened the door to abortion restrictions, some Democrats now believe they might have found an issue that will make them more competitive in the midterm elections. Joining us now is veteran Democratic strategist, a friend, James Carville. James, thanks for being here.
Well, Rob, it's good to be here. You do a great job covering American politics. Glad to be part of the show.
Only wish I could be there with you in New Orleans. James, what's the consequence of Kansas?
Well, somebody's a political earthquake. I mean, they said of Mike Tyson that he hit you so hard he changes the way you taste. I mean, American politics tastes different today. I was campaigning in Kansas a week before the ballot proposition, and you could feel there was a lot of energy, and they ran a very smart messaging. They talked about Kansans for constitutional freedom, and they were very careful to make it about freedom and interference, and you know how these right-wing preachers and these Catholic bishops tried to rig the whole deal in their favor, and people resented it. And I got to tell you, the turnout was enormous, and the margin was huge. But I hope the Democrats take from this to lesson that, you know, we need constitutional protections and talk about that. We need to expand rights. And I think that's more effective messaging than just, you know, talking about it in other terms. They were very smart the way they went about this.
James, I keep thinking about your famous phrase from 1992, it's the economy, stupid. That's what so many Republicans keep saying these days. How do Democrats make it about more than the economy in the final 90 or so days?
Well, I think we need to talk about what the president is doing or trying to do to negate some of the effects of inflation. You know, can really talk about gas prices. I mean, everybody wants to pivot. I don't think you can pivot away from the concerns people have. But, you know, Robert, you've been doing this long enough, and, you know, even like Ron Brownstein, there's decoupling out there because the Republicans should be doing a lot better if you get direction of the country and presidential approval, which are two pretty reliable indicators of off-year elections. As of now, they're acting weirdly. They're not lining up the way they're supposed to. I don't know. Some Republicans say, well, when it gets close to election day, it will. I have no idea if they're right or not. But this situation is what's the word? Sui generis. We just never seen anything like this before in American politics. And I'd be lying if I said I had great confidence in which way it turned out. But if you told me as a Democrat that we would be on June the 4th, that we'd be where we are today on August the 4th, I would have been pretty pleased. I wouldn't have thought that.
On the economy, is the inflation issue, especially with gas prices, baked in, or if gas prices continue to drop, will the Democrats be able to run on some of that?
Well, it can't hurt. I mean, they're still historically high. But they have come down, and I mean, the hope is that they'll continue to come down. But I'm not very good at predicting gas prices. But if there are other things in what Kansas showed, and you know what we see in a Nebraska special election, the electorate is not behaving as you would expect it to do with some of the stuff. And you know, the other thing is there's still a lot of jobs being created. I mean, it's not like there's no economy out there. I mean, Biden's probably created more jobs in his first 18 months as president than anybody else. And so it's not all doom and gloom.
What about President Biden? What's your assessment politically of where he stands inside his own party? You've heard the comments from Congresswoman Maloney and others that he might not run. What's your take on what all that chatter means?
You know, I'll think about any of that after this election, but I'm kind of like this. That a statesman looks to the next generation, a politician to the next election. I look to the next tracking poll. I mean, I'm just, you know, my concerns are immediate. But if he runs a re-election right now, I think he's got you know, he's accomplished a lot. I don't know how much credit he gets for it, but and let's see if they can land this airplane on this Senator Manchin, Senator Schumer deal. And if they do, it'll be pretty remarkable. But it's tough to land the plane sometimes.
Do you believe President Biden should run again in 2024?
I think he's earned the right to be the Democratic nominee if that's what he chooses to do. I think he's done a good job as president, and he'll, as he approaches that, he'll make his decisions.
But should he do it?
I know, again, you check with me after the election. I'm not into giving President Biden. I think he has a remarkable record, and I'll talk about, if he has a successful record to run on, and ask me after the election.
Vice President Harris was in Boston today talking about abortion rights. How do you see her role in the midterm season?
I don't think people are going to, she can obviously can rally parts of the Democratic base, but I don't think I've never seen a midterm where a vice president was really a consequential figure in that midterm. But it's good that she was, she's rallying people, and I'm sure she's raising a lot of money for the party, and there are a lot of campaigns that'll bring her in. But I don't. I'm stretching my mind to think of maybe Cheney had some influence in electorally, but generally elections decide on something else other than the vice president.
So Kansas now is a big variable, changed the whole way people think about this midterm election. What about if former President Trump jumps in early into the 2024 race? What would that mean for the midterms?
I kind of hope he does. I mean, I think the more that he's out there, the kind of better it is for us, because he's popular with a certain part, maybe it's a majority of the Republican Party, but not much more than that. And I think if he makes it about him, that's fine with me. I would encourage him to get out there early. I don't have any political fear of him, and I don't have very much political fear of the people that he got nominated in like Arizona and places like that. I think the best thing to do is smoke these people out and beat them at the polls. That's the best way to curb Trumpism. A lot of my friends are, criticizing the Democrats for running these spots, promoting these Trumpist candidates. I'm totally comfortable with that. I think that's really a smart thing to do. And
what about the risk to democracy, James, if you're promoting a candidate who's an election denier and they win? Well,
sometimes you got to trust democracy. And they voted for these people. The Democrats did not vote for this clown in Michigan. They didn't vote for these clowns in Arizona. The Republican primary voters put them in there. And I, as opposed to being afraid of that, I think the best way to save democracy is to actually win at the ballot box, not to act like the threat, to expose these people, bring them out in the open, and then open fire on them, open political fire, obviously. So I don't, and they're trying to win an election. That's what you're supposed to do. When I ran campaigns, I had one goal in mind.
But there are no guarantees in politics, James. Someone could easily slip through the cracks and win an election and then hold up things if they're an election denier once they're in office.
It's Republicans that voted for these people. It wasn't Democrats. And
but Democrats are spending some money on it.
What they think is in their best interest. And we're going to win that election in Michigan. All right. And sometimes you do this stuff and it doesn't work. Look, you run a risk that it backfires. But when you're in a cycle like this, a tough cycle, you do anything that you can illegal to try to give yourself an advantage. And I'm not upset. Not only I'm not upset about this, I would do the exact same thing if I was in the DCCC's position.
You've been a longtime friend of the Clinton family. Should Secretary Clinton, former President Clinton, be called on by Democrats to be out there on the campaign trail in this final stretch?
I'm sure she's talking to, his campaigns and things. But, the party, one of the things that the Democrats have to do is, we got to embrace the younger generation. I was out in Kansas campaigning against the Noah amendment for a guy 31 years old, Patrick Schmidt. We need to really get behind some sort of fresh people. And I consider myself an old fogey. I'll be 78 this October. But, I think we got to show people that we're part of the future. And that's a critical thing all across.
A final thing here, James. I think I can see you're wearing an LSU sweatshirt. Is that right?
That's correct. Yes, sir.
Well, LSU took. I'm a Notre Dame guy. You took our former coach Brian Kelly. Do you have confidence that Brian Kelly is going to revive your football program?
100%. And you know what's interesting, Robert? The Notre Dame people said, that's terrible. LSU came, and something big money in college football, post our coach. Well, Notre Dame poached him from Cincinnati after he went 12-0. I didn't see anybody at Notre Dame say, oh, poor Cincinnati. And, I mean, college football is a rough and tumble game. This guy is the winningest coach in the history of Notre Dame. And I've been very, very impressed with what I've seen down here. And there's been a lot of talk, well, he's never been in the South. You know, two coaches that never coached a game in the South till they came down South? Nick Saban and Urban Meyer. And I think they got like 8 national championships.
Well, James, we'll see. I may have to come down for that LSU-Alabama game and see if your prophecy pans out down there this season. But James Carville, thanks so much for being here. We appreciate it.
You got it, Robert. You would be welcome anytime. I'll take you to the game. I know people. I can get good tickets.
I don't doubt that.